The year was 1968, and Michael Patterson was 22 years old when he first set foot in the jungles of Vietnam. He came from a small town in Nebraska, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the local diner served the same coffee for 30 years, and where going off to war was considered both an honor and a duty. Michael had enlisted straight out of high school, driven by the same patriotic fervor that swept through America in those days. His father had fought in World War II and his grandfather in the First World War. Service was in his blood, or so he thought. Nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to experience in the dense forests near the Cambodian border. Michael was assigned to a reconnaissance unit, one of those small teams that operated in the shadows, gathering intelligence and reporting enemy movements. They called themselves the Ghost Platoon because they moved silently, left no trace, and disappeared into the jungle like smoke. For the first 3 months, everything went according to plan. They completed their missions, avoided major confrontations, and made it back to base without losing a single man. But on a humid night in October, something changed. The air felt different, heavier somehow, and the usual sounds of the jungle had gone completely silent. No crickets, no birds, nothing. Michael's commanding officer, Lieutenant Davis, noticed it too. He ordered the men to halt and take defensive positions. They waited in the darkness, weapons ready, hearts pounding. That's when they saw the lights. At first, Michael thought it might be enemy helicopters, but the lights moved in ways that defied logic. They hovered without making a sound, darted left and right at impossible speeds, and emitted a strange bluish-white glow that illuminated the canopy above. There were 3 of them, triangular in shape, each about the size of a school bus. The platoon watched in stunned silence as these objects performed maneuvers that no aircraft in 1968 could possibly execute. Lieutenant Davis grabbed his radio and tried to report what they were seeing to command, but the radio was dead. Every piece of electronic equipment they had stopped working the moment those lights appeared. One of the objects descended lower, maybe 100 feet above the ground, and that's when Michael felt it. A pressure in his chest, like someone was squeezing his lungs. His vision blurred, and he struggled to breathe. The other men experienced the same thing. Private Johnson collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Sergeant Matthews tried to move, but found his legs wouldn't respond. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights shot straight up into the night sky and vanished. The jungle sounds returned. The radio crackled back to life. Everything seemed normal again, except nothing would ever be normal for Michael Patterson. When they returned to base the next morning, Lieutenant Davis filed a detailed report about the incident. He described what they saw, how their equipment malfunctioned, and the physical effects the men experienced. The report was stamped classified within hours. An officer Michael had never seen before arrived at the camp, interviewed each member of the platoon separately, and made it very clear that what they saw never happened. They were told it was likely enemy flares or weather balloons reflecting moonlight. When Lieutenant Davis protested, insisting that what they witnessed was neither flares nor balloons, he was reassigned to a desk job in Saigon within the week. Michael tried to move on. He completed his tour, earned his medals, and returned home to Nebraska in 1970. He married his high school sweetheart, Sarah, got a job at the local hardware store, and did his best to live a normal life. But the memory of that night haunted him. He would wake up in cold sweats, seeing those lights in his dreams. Sarah noticed the change in him. He had left Nebraska as an optimistic young man and returned as someone who carried a weight she couldn't understand. Michael didn't talk about Vietnam much, not even to her. What could he say? That he saw something the government denied existed, that he and his entire platoon had been witnesses to something unexplainable. Years passed, And Michael buried the experience deep down, convincing himself that maybe the officer had been right. Maybe it was just flares or some experimental aircraft he wasn't supposed to know about. But in 1991, everything changed again. Michael was 45 years old, working as the manager of the hardware store, when he received a letter in the mail. It was from Thomas Hayes, one of the men from his old platoon. Thomas had tracked him down after all those years and wrote that he needed to talk about that night in 1968. They arranged to meet at a diner halfway between Nebraska and Ohio, where Thomas now lived. When Michael saw Thomas walk through that diner door, he barely recognized him. The man had aged poorly, his face lined with stress, his eyes carrying the same haunted look Michael saw in his own mirror every morning. They sat in a booth in the back, ordered coffee, and Thomas pulled out a folder filled with documents. He had been collecting evidence for years, reaching out to other veterans who had similar experiences in Vietnam, filing Freedom of Information Act requests and piecing together a puzzle that the government had worked hard to keep hidden. Thomas spread the documents across the table, and Michael's hands trembled as he looked through them. There were dozens of reports from other military personnel who had witnessed unexplained aerial phenomena in Vietnam. Pilots who tracked objects on radar that moved at speeds exceeding anything humanly possible. Ground troops who reported seeing lights that paralyzed them temporarily. Naval officers who observed craft emerging from and diving back into the ocean near the coast. Every single report had been classified, buried in filing cabinets, and dismissed as misidentifications or equipment malfunctions. Thomas had found a pattern. These sightings clustered around certain areas in Vietnam, particularly near the Cambodian and Laotian borders, and they seemed to occur more frequently during periods of heavy combat. Some reports mentioned electronic equipment failures, just like what Michael's platoon experienced. Others described physical effects, temporary paralysis, difficulty breathing, and intense feelings of being watched. What disturbed Michael most was a memo he found in the stack dated December 1968, just 2 months after his encounter. It came from a Pentagon office he had never heard of, instructing field commanders to immediately classify any reports of unidentified aerial phenomena and to discourage military personnel from discussing such incidents. The memo specifically mentioned the Ghost Platoon by name and referenced Lieutenant Davis's report. This wasn't just a cover-up of one incident. This was a systematic effort to silence anyone who saw these things. Thomas leaned across the table and spoke in a low voice, telling Michael that Lieutenant Davis had died in 1975. The official cause was a car accident, but Thomas had spoken to Davis's widow, and she told him that her husband had been planning to go public with what he knew. He had been in contact with a journalist and was prepared to share his story. 3 days before his scheduled interview, his car went off a bridge on a clear, dry night on a road he had driven hundreds of times before. Michael felt his world shifting. He had spent 2 decades trying to forget that night, trying to convince himself it wasn't important. And now he was faced with evidence that what he saw was part of something much larger. Thomas wanted to go public. He wanted to take these documents to the media, to force the government to acknowledge what had been happening. But Michael hesitated. He had a family, a business, a life he had carefully rebuilt after the war. Going public meant risking everything. It meant being labeled as crazy or a conspiracy theorist. It meant potentially putting himself and his loved ones in danger if what happened to Lieutenant Davis was more than just an accident. They argued in that diner for hours. Thomas accused him of being a coward, of letting the government get away with lying to the American people. Michael fired back that being reckless wouldn't help anyone, that they needed to be smart about this, strategic. Eventually, they agreed to a compromise. They would continue gathering evidence, reaching out to more veterans, building a case so strong that it couldn't be ignored. They would work quietly, carefully, until they had enough documentation to present to Congress or the media with credibility. Over the next 3 years, Michael and Thomas became investigators. They drove across the country, meeting with veterans who had similar experiences. They collected sworn statements, copied documents, and created a network of people who had been silenced for too long. Michael learned that these sightings weren't limited to Vietnam. There were reports from military personnel going back to World War II, continuing through Korea, and extending beyond Vietnam into more recent conflicts. The government had been aware of these phenomena for decades and had actively worked to keep them secret. In 1994, Michael received a visit at his home. 2 men in dark suits showed up at his door, identified themselves as federal agents, and politely asked to speak with him. They knew everything. They knew about his meetings with Thomas, about the documents they had collected, about every veteran they had contacted. They sat in Michael's living room and explained that what he was doing was dangerous, not because the government wanted to harm him, but because he didn't understand the full picture. They couldn't tell him what those lights were, they said, but they assured him that it was a matter of national security that this information remained classified. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more forgotten tales of American heroes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more stories the government never wanted you to know about. Now, let's get back to Michael. The agents left Michael with a warning and a choice. He could continue his investigation and face consequences, or he could walk away and live his life in peace. Michael didn't sleep that night. He thought about Sarah, about his 2 daughters who were in college, about the store and the community he was part of. But he also thought about Lieutenant Davis, about the other men in his platoon, and about all the veterans who had been told to stay silent about what they experienced. The next morning, he called Thomas and told him about the visit. Thomas wasn't surprised. He had received a similar visit weeks earlier but hadn't mentioned it because he didn't want to scare Michael off. They made a decision right there on the phone. They weren't going to stop, but they were going to be more careful. They started using payphones instead of their home phones, communicated through coded language, and stored their documents in multiple locations. They felt ridiculous, like characters in a spy movie, but the visit from those agents had made it clear that someone was watching them. In 1996, they finally got the breakthrough they had been waiting for. A former Pentagon analyst named Dr. Robert Chen reached out to them. Dr. Chen had worked in a classified program during the Vietnam War, analyzing reports of aerial phenomena. He had left government service years ago and was now willing to talk. He couldn't provide documents because everything he worked on remained classified, but he could confirm that there had been an official program dedicated to studying these sightings. The government knew these objects were real, he said. They had radar data, photographic evidence, and testimony from credible military witnesses, but they couldn't explain what they were, where they came from, or what their purpose was. That uncertainty terrified the people in power more than the phenomena themselves. Dr. Chen explained that the decision to classify and deny these incidents came from the highest levels. It wasn't about hiding the truth from the public as much as it was about maintaining control and avoiding mass panic. In the late 1960s, America was already dealing with social upheaval, civil rights movements, and anti-war protests. The last thing the government wanted was to add fuel to that fire by admitting they had encountered something they couldn't explain or defend against. Armed with Dr. Chen's testimony, Michael and Thomas approached a journalist named Linda Martinez, who worked for a major newspaper. They spent an entire day walking her through their evidence, showing her documents, introducing her to veterans who were willing to go on record, and explaining the pattern they had uncovered. Linda was intrigued but cautious. She needed more verification, more sources, more concrete proof, before her editors would even consider running such a story. She began her own investigation, reaching out to her contacts in the military and government. Months passed, and Linda kept digging. She confirmed that the documents Michael and Thomas had collected were authentic. She verified the identities of the veterans who provided testimony. She even found additional evidence they hadn't uncovered, including a former Air Force pilot who had footage of an encounter that occurred over the Gulf of Tonkin. Everything was coming together for what would be a groundbreaking story. But then, suddenly, Linda stopped returning their calls. When Michael finally reached her, she sounded different, distant. She told him that her editors had decided not to run the story. There wasn't enough public interest in Vietnam War history, they said. The evidence was too circumstantial, too dependent on testimony that couldn't be fully verified. Michael knew those were excuses. Someone had gotten to the newspaper, applied pressure, or made it clear that publishing this story would have consequences. He felt defeated. They had spent years gathering evidence, putting themselves at risk, and they were no closer to exposing the truth than when they started. Thomas took it even harder. He became obsessed, convinced that there had to be another way to get the information out. He started talking about taking the documents directly to Congress, about holding a press conference on the steps of the Capitol building, about forcing the issue no matter what it took. Michael tried to reason with him, tried to make him see that they needed to be strategic, but Thomas was beyond reasoning. In 1998, Thomas Hayes died of a heart attack. He was 51 years old. The official report said it was natural causes, stress, and poor health. Michael attended the funeral and spoke with Thomas's widow, who handed him a letter Thomas had written shortly before his death. In it, Thomas apologized for dragging Michael into this investigation and expressed his frustration at never being able to tell the truth about what they saw that night in Vietnam. He wrote that the hardest part wasn't the government denial or the threats or the wasted years. The hardest part was knowing that history was being rewritten, that future generations would never know what really happened in those jungles. After Thomas died, Michael stepped back from the investigation. He was 52 years old, tired and grief-stricken. He returned to his normal life, running the hardware store, spending time with his family, and trying to make peace with the fact that some battles can't be won. But he kept all the documents Thomas had collected, stored them safely, and waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but he felt like the story wasn't over yet. Years passed quietly. Michael watched his daughters graduate from college, get married, and have children of their own. He watched the world change with the turn of the millennium, saw the rise of the internet, and witnessed how information spread differently than it had in his younger days. In 2004, he read a news article about a government program that had been studying unidentified aerial phenomena. The article was brief, barely a few paragraphs, but it confirmed what Michael had known all along. The government had been investigating these sightings, and they had evidence. The article didn't mention Vietnam specifically, but it opened a door that Michael thought had been permanently closed. He started scanning the documents he and Thomas had collected, uploading them to a website he created. He didn't use his real name, didn't identify himself as a veteran, just presented the evidence and let people draw their own conclusions. The website didn't get much traffic at first, but slowly other veterans started reaching out. They shared their own stories, added their own documents, and created a digital archive of experiences that had been suppressed for decades. Michael realized that the internet had changed the game. The government could silence journalists and threaten individuals, but they couldn't control the flow of information online the same way they had controlled it in the past. By 2007, Michael's website had thousands of visitors each month. Researchers, journalists, and military historians were using it as a resource. Some dismissed it as conspiracy theory nonsense, but others recognized the value of the testimony and documentation. Michael even heard from active-duty military personnel who had recent experiences similar to what he witnessed in 1968. The phenomena hadn't stopped after Vietnam. They were still occurring, still being classified, and still being denied by official channels. In 2017, something remarkable happened. The Pentagon acknowledged the existence of a program that investigated reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. Major news organizations ran stories about military pilots encountering objects that perform maneuvers beyond the capability of any known aircraft. Video footage was released showing these encounters, and suddenly, the topic that had been relegated to the fringes of conspiracy theory was being discussed seriously by mainstream media and government officials. Michael was 71 years old when he watched these news reports. He felt a complicated mix of vindication and sadness. He was right. Thomas had been right. Lieutenant Davis had been right. But they had spent decades being dismissed, threatened, and silenced. Thomas never got to see this moment of validation, never got to hear government officials admit that these phenomena were real and worthy of serious study. Michael decided it was time to come forward with his full story. He contacted several journalists and told them he was the person behind the website that had been documenting military encounters with unexplained phenomena. He provided his real name, his military service records, and the complete archive of documents he and Thomas had collected. The response was overwhelming. News outlets wanted to interview him, documentary filmmakers wanted to tell his story, and researchers wanted access to his archive. Michael appeared on news programs, gave interviews to newspapers, and finally, after nearly 50 years, told the world about that night in October 1968, when he and his platoon saw something the Pentagon still couldn't fully explain. He talked about Lieutenant Davis, about Thomas Hayes, about all the veterans who had similar experiences and were never believed. He talked about the cover-up, the threats, and the decades of denial. Some people still dismissed his story. Some accused him of seeking attention or fabricating evidence, but many more listened and recognized the courage it took to speak up, the years of frustration he had endured, and the importance of the questions his experience raised. The government response was predictable. They acknowledged that Michael Patterson had served honorably in Vietnam, confirmed that reports of unusual aerial phenomena had been filed during that period, but stated that they could neither confirm nor deny the specific details of his account due to the classified nature of certain military operations. It was a carefully worded non-answer, the kind of bureaucratic language designed to say nothing while appearing to address the issue. Michael didn't care about the government's response anymore. He had accomplished what he and Thomas set out to do decades earlier. The truth was out there now, documented and available for anyone who wanted to investigate further. He had done his duty, not just as a soldier who served his country in Vietnam, but as a citizen who believed that the American people deserved honesty from their government. In his final interviews, Michael reflected on what the experience taught him. He talked about how easy it is for powerful institutions to control narratives, to silence uncomfortable truths, and to make people doubt their own experiences. He talked about the importance of persistence, of not giving up even when the odds seem impossible. And he talked about the cost of secrecy, how it corrodes trust between the government and the people it serves. Michael Patterson passed away in 2021 at the age of 75. His obituary in the local Nebraska newspaper mentioned his military service, his years running the hardware store, and his dedication to his family. It also mentioned briefly that he had spent decades investigating unexplained phenomena he witnessed during the Vietnam War. His website remains online, maintained by researchers and veterans who continue to add new information and testimony. The archive he and Thomas Hayes created has become a valuable resource for anyone studying the history of unidentified aerial phenomena and government secrecy. The Pentagon still hasn't fully explained what Michael saw that night in 1968. They've released some documents, acknowledged some programs, and admitted that they don't have answers for everything their military personnel has reported over the years. But the full truth remains classified, buried in filing cabinets and computer systems that most Americans will never access. Michael's story reminds us that history isn't just written by the powerful. It's also preserved by ordinary people who refuse to let their experiences be erased, who document what they've seen, and who speak up even when it's dangerous or difficult. He was just a kid from Nebraska who went to war and saw something he couldn't explain. But he spent the rest of his life fighting to make sure that experience mattered, that the truth had a chance to surface, and that future generations would know that some questions are still worth asking, even when the answers are uncomfortable. The lights Michael saw that night in the Vietnamese jungle remain a mystery. Were they advanced military technology being tested without the knowledge of ground troops? Were they something else entirely, something that challenges our understanding of what's possible? We may never know for certain. But what we do know is that Michael Patterson and men like him deserve to have their experiences taken seriously, their testimony respected, and their courage acknowledged. They served their country with honor, and they continued serving it long after they came home by refusing to let the truth be buried forever.